In 1944, Europe was engulfed in the most devastating phase of the Second World War. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was pushing west after a decisive victory over Hitler's forces at Stalingrad and Kursk. Meanwhile, the Allies had landed in Normandy and were advancing towards Germany. However, amid these monumental confrontations between empires, another conflict was emerging, one defined not just by national rivalry, but by differing visions for the future of Europe. In occupied Poland, this struggle manifested as the Warsaw Rising, a desperate and widespread uprising initiated by the Polish Home Army in August 1944, aimed at freeing the capital from Nazi control before the Soviets arrived. Yet Poland's situation was far more intricate than merely fighting against Germany. For years, it had been trapped between two imperial powers, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. By 1944, it was uncertain if being liberated would lead to genuine freedom or just another form of oppression. This exploration will delve into how Poland's distinctive position, caught between a crumbling German regime and the advancing Soviet agenda, transformed Warsaw into the stage for a tragic and brutal chapter where the imperial interests of Britain, the USSR, and the exiled Polish government collided with the fervent aspirations of a population rebelling against tyranny. We'll uncover how this moment illuminates the deeper conflicts within the Allied cause and how the Warsaw Rising exemplifies the parallel and often conflicting wars that were quietly playing out beneath the surface of the global struggle. Greece's experience may suggest that the primary conflict on the Allied side during the Second World War was mainly between communists and non-communists, rather than involving intertwined and occasionally opposing wars. The Warsaw Rising of 1944 serves as a valuable case study in this debate, with Russia itself standing as the main actor in Allied imperialism. In the early 17th century, Poland was a significant European power, with a population comparable to that of France and a territory rivaling that of Russia. Yet, as a historian noted, Poland lacked the strategic geographic advantage that allowed countries like Spain and Sweden to retreat into isolation after their expansionist efforts faltered. Being more central in location, Poland was ultimately doomed to obliteration as a state in the latter half of the 18th century. The country underwent partition 3 times, with Russia, Prussia, and Austria taking the spoils. Despite several heroic uprisings, partition continued until the First World War. Modern Poland began to take shape after the Russian Revolution in 1917, when Lenin put forth the idea of self-determination, advocating for equality of rights for all nations and their ability to form independent states. This approach drew some unexpected criticism from the Polish revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg, who believed that the pursuit of national independence, where both rich and poor united against foreign dominance, was less progressive than the idea of socialist internationalism, the collaboration of Russian and Polish workers against a shared capitalist adversary. While Lenin agreed that socialist internationalism was the ultimate aim, he emphasized that Polish workers would not feel secure in that goal if they believed their former imperial oppressor denied them independence. Regardless of who was ultimately right, Luxemburg's cautions about the negative aspects of Polish nationalism became evident when the country was reinstated following the fall of the German and Austrian empires. Marshal Pilsudski, the first ruler, supported by France's General Weygand, launched an attack on Soviet Russia and captured territory inhabited by millions of Ukrainians, land far exceeding the original borders claimed in 1772. They even took advantage of the German invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1939 to seize Szczecin. Thus, at the beginning of the Second World War, a third of the Polish population belonged to national minorities. Domestically, Pilsudski established Sanacja, a dictatorship that persisted beyond his life and continued to govern Poland as the Second World War commenced. Ironically, participating in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia foreshadowed Poland becoming a target of Nazi aggression. In response, Britain and France pledged to support Polish independence, even if it meant going to war. Meanwhile, Stalin distanced himself, stating he would not engage in conflicts instigated by warmongers who relied on others to solve their problems. His reluctance had nothing to do with Bolshevik anti-imperialism, as the Stalinist counter-revolution had obliterated any remnants of that ideology. Moscow was signaling its willingness to enter the Hitler-Stalin Pact in August 1939, an agreement that secretly partitioned Poland between Germany and Russia. The Anglo-French policy of appeasement likely convinced Moscow that compromise with Berlin was necessary. Still, the pact was an astonishingly bold move. Nazism and Bolshevism stood in stark opposition to one another, and the Nazis had brutally murdered thousands of German communists. All of this was disregarded as the Soviet Union supplied Hitler with essential resources in exchange for weaponry. Upon learning the pact had been finalized, a delighted Hitler pounded on the wall, crying out with joy, "I have the world in my pocket." As Germany launched its campaign to reclaim Poland, the Russians allowed the Wehrmacht to take the lead in the fighting, reducing their own risks and concealing their greed. The Nazis were asked to estimate when they would capture Warsaw, which would signal Russia to take its portion. However, they miscalculated, and Moscow initiated its attack 10 days too soon. In a misstep, the joint Nazi-Soviet victory parade at Brest-Litovsk occurred before the city actually fell on September 27th. Yet, Stalin audaciously claimed that the Red Army had only acted to rescue the Polish people from the unfortunate war into which they were drawn by their misguided leaders, allowing them to live peacefully. Privately, he claimed that German-Soviet friendship had been sealed in blood, specifically the blood of 216,000 Poles. The campaign cost Germany 60,000 soldiers and Russia 11,500. When the fighting ended, Stalin controlled 52% of Polish territory while Hitler held 48%. They both agreed to tolerate no Polish agitation affecting the territories of the other party and to suppress any beginnings of such agitation in their territories. Despite this agreement, a strong resistance movement emerged, differing from the Greek and Yugoslav resistance due to the minimal gap between the local imperial government and the anti-fascist opposition. The key difference stemmed from the unique roles of Poland's communists and ruling elite. Unlike the prominent role of the communist parties in Greece and Yugoslavia's wars, Poland's communists were not featured in this struggle. By 1938, they had been decimated by Moscow, and the party was formally dissolved once Poland ceased to exist. To add context, a quarter of the 1 million ethnic Poles living in the Soviet Union were executed before the war even started. By 1941, when Hitler took over Stalin's part of Poland and invaded Russia, Moscow began backing a new communist party, the Polish Workers' Party. However, it struggled to gain traction due to its ties with a former occupier. In other occupied nations, the elite preferred to collaborate or stay passive rather than embrace a people's uprising. For the Polish ruling class, navigating the German and Russian occupied zones was fraught with difficulty. Hitler viewed Poles as more like animals than human beings. In his quest to colonize Western Poland, he either exterminated or enslaved its residents. His brutal methods led to the displacement of around 900,000 people, and in some areas, speaking Polish in public was outright banned. Polish children were taught only to write their names, count up to 500, and the basic idea that they must obey Germany. Meanwhile, Eastern Poland faced severe oppression under Russian rule. Here, Stalin sought total control, driven more by a need for power than by racist ideology. Yet, like in Nazi-occupied Poland, there were no political distinctions made among those who suffered. Polish communists faced the same fates as Catholic priests, university professors, farmers, and railway workers. One notorious act of the Russian regime was the execution of thousands of Polish officers at Katyn. Up to 2 million people were deported for forced labor, many never to return. A recent study comparing both occupations suggests that while the Russian occupation was less violent, it still featured significant collective terror. The Nazi SS and the Russian secret police often synchronized their methods. Caught between two brutal forces, Poland lost over 6 million lives, marking the highest death toll percentage of any nation during World War II. 90% of those killed were civilians, and half were Jewish. A resistance leaflet from 1940 highlighted the grim reality. History has taught the Polish nation a dreadful lesson. For us, now, the the road to freedom leads through the torture chambers and the Gestapo and the Russian GPU. Hence, the Poles could assert that collaboration and compromise were impossible. The tragedy affected all segments of society. Poland's resistance began within the military, the central institution of the Sanaccia dictatorship before the war. Major General Tokarzewski, a supporter of Pilsudski, organized what became known as the Underground Home Army, or AK. This laid the groundwork for its future development. An author noted that throughout its existence, the AK was mainly led and staffed by members of the Polish military who carried forward ideas, attitudes, traditions, and professional standards from their time in the pre-war army. In essence, the AK leadership was rooted in a tradition of reactionary dictatorship and imperialist ideals. Historian Norman Davies underscores the significance of the AK, suggesting it represented the entirety of the anti-fascist movement, stating that the largest resistance force in Europe, initially called the Union of Armed Struggle and later the Home Army, operated as a faction of the regular Polish armed forces. The AK achieved remarkable results. 380,000 fighters executed 25,000 acts of sabotage over 3 years, and by 1945 had killed 150,000 Germans. However, if that were the complete narrative, the concept of a people's war wouldn't have emerged. There were two other significant components. One was the underground state, led by General Sikorski, a critic of the Sanaccia regime. Sikorski asserted that the movement should not limit itself to military resistance, but must evolve into an actual state, insisting that a state apparatus must be established and upheld at all costs, no matter how rudimentary. The outcomes were impressive. Although its headquarters were in London, they replicated a full range of government institutions in Poland. The Ministry of Education educated 1 million children and operated universities in major cities like Krakow, Lwów, and Vilno, allocating 30% of its resources to social welfare. This shadow state had a parliament known as the Political Representation, and a Directorate of Civilian Resistance acted as a judicial system that prosecuted collaborators. A vast underground press with a multitude of publications also thrived. The third faction in the resistance comprised the Socialist, Peasant, Christian Labor, and National Democrat parties, with the first three positioned to the left of the Sanaccia, while the National Democrats were aligned with Dmowski. He was a right-wing anti-Semite who criticized the threat of socialism within the country and the danger posed by the Jewish element, which represented international forces that could bring no good and potentially cause great harm. It showed Dmowski's lingering influence that even after the tragedies of 1939 to 1945, Komorowski, the commander of the AK, could still appeal to anti-Semitism in his memoirs, noting that Jews had indeed been a foreign presence within the Polish community. These political parties embodied the majority of politically active Poles. While there were some elements of resistance outside the Sanaccia-controlled army, it might seem that Poland's resistance did not include a people's war. However, recent history challenges this view. Hundreds of underground organizations were formed from below, rooted in existing bonds of family, work, friendship, and neighborhood connections. As a result, numerous conspiratorial networks arose as a testament to spontaneous rebellion against this degradation, rather than being established from above, although the numerical relationship between these two types of organizations remains unclear. A direct participant noted that anyone with imagination, ambition, initiative, and a lot of courage could, and often did, start their own group. The dynamic interplay between imperialist and people's war elements has led to heated debates about the balance between right and left within the resistance. One Jewish woman remarked, "I wasn't scared of the Germans, I was scared of the Poles." Meanwhile, members of the resistance supported the Jewish Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April 1943 and sheltered survivors. Around 15,000 to 20,000 Jews found refuge in Warsaw beyond the ghetto walls, and the Zagoda organization, dedicated to rescuing Jews, was closely tied to the Polish government in exile. One book concludes that no national group has as many, often contradictory, reports and opinions as the Poles. Poland stood out for having consistent involvement from both upper and lower class forces in its resistance, but significant internal tensions existed. The intersection of People's War and Imperialist War was never comfortable or complete. Alongside the divide between left and right parties, those supporting the Sanacja regime found themselves in a precarious position next to civilians who held that very system responsible for Poland's shameful defeat. A notable moment of tension unfolded during a crucial phase of the Warsaw Rising. Poland's military commander-in-chief, Sosnowski, distanced himself to orchestrate a coup against the civilian government leader, Mikolajczyk, fearing that a compromise with the Russians was imminent. Another concern was the resistance's strong focus on Polish nationalism, which excluded the non-Polish third of the population within the pre-1939 borders. Despite the hurdles to attentism, the AK was tempted to pursue it, driven by the same fears as other official resistance movements. Primarily, the anxiety that mass actions could unleash dangerous social upheaval, along with the aim to avoid Nazi reprisals, which were particularly brutal in Poland. Komorowski initially based his strategy on the belief that the German Western Front would eventually falter, offering a favorable chance for a successful uprising. In other words, he believed that significant action could only follow Anglo-French success. He perceived France's fall in 1940 as a critical blow, causing their plans to unravel, and resolved to adopt a long-term strategy focused on intelligence gathering and propaganda efforts. However, attentism soon proved impractical. When the Nazis began forcibly removing Poles from the Lublin and Zamość areas to clear space for ethnic Germans, there was no alternative but to sanction the formation of partisan units, which helped halt the expulsions. Yet the AK still hesitated to take more extreme measures. Ultimately, they were compelled to embrace the tactics of a popular war due to the unfolding pressures of the situation. One contributing factor was Britain's betrayal of the Polish cause, as the nation housing the government in exile became a source of dashed hopes. While the stated reason for the war in 1939 was to defend Polish sovereignty, Britain prioritized fostering ties with Moscow, a fellow major power, even in light of the Hitler-Stalin Pact. As early as October 1939, London made it clear that it believed Russia should retain 90% of its illegally acquired territories. When Russia switched sides to join the Allies, Churchill pressed Sikorsky to sign a treaty with Stalin that effectively acknowledged this acquisition. News of the Cotton Massacre shattered the forced alliance, yet it did not alter British policy overall. Would Roosevelt support the resistance, considering the significant Polish population in the USA? He showed even more deference to Stalin than Churchill did. Until 1944, no help arrived. As the Warsaw Rising approached, the U.S. offered $10 million, while the Poles had requested $97 million, but only if they collaborated with the Red Army. It wasn't until the Rising was well underway that any funds were actually released. Karski, an emissary of the underground state who risked everything to inform the Allies of its existence, bitterly noted their indifference. I quickly recognized that the outside world couldn't grasp. It has never understood or valued the sacrifice and heroism of our nationwide refusal to collaborate. The whole concept of the underground state was often beyond their comprehension. This lack of understanding stemmed not from a deficiency of imagination, but from the shared interests of the Allied imperialists. Their negative stance diminished the operational capacity of the Polish resistance. Although the underground army produced some of its own equipment, in 1944, its hundreds of thousands of volunteers were armed with only 32,000 guns. With Russia unlikely to provide more weapons, the AK looked to Britain for support. The excuse of geographical distance was given for the refusal, but the more significant factor was likely the direct conversations between British and Russian intelligence services. Consequently, leading up to the Warsaw Rising, the amount of supplies the AK received was merely 1/10 and 1/18 of what was sent to Greece and France, respectively. Such disregard for Polish ambitions caused rifts between the London exiles, closely tied to the Allies, and the AK commanders, who faced pressure from the populace at home. Compare the government statements to those made in Warsaw right before the Rising. The former firmly aligned with the Anglo-French perspective: free Poland, will serve as a strong support for the Western-cultured Slavic nations and other smaller countries situated between Germany and Russia. This declaration intentionally distanced itself from any radical ideas. In Warsaw, General Bohr-Komorowski was expected to express similar views. He had been chosen as AK commander for being an aristocratic cavalry officer with known right-wing beliefs. Furthermore, he attempted to integrate the fascist NSZ into his ranks for quite some time, despite their ongoing violence against the left-wing supporters of the government in exile and communists. However, Bohr-Komorowski faced the escalating success of the Red Army, which stirred a sense of impatience that allowed the communist PPR to start making progress. One historian notes that Poland was experiencing a surge of radical sentiment, echoing the desires of resistance movements across Europe for a more just world post-war, equality, and full employment. A clear indication of this shift came in August 1943, when the right-wing National Democrats shockingly supported a proposal for a planned economy that included nationalizing public utilities, key industries, and banking, as well as requisitioning large private estates for the public good and ensuring health, education, and social services. General Bohr-Komorowski recognized the need to align with this sentiment, worried that his group of right-wing officers might clash with the diverse members of the AK. In July 1944, he cautioned London against stagnation, warning that the PPR could take the lead in the fight against the Germans, risking popular collaboration with the Soviets. To position himself as a leader in the people's struggle, Bohr-Komorowski called for a Poland operating in the interests of the working masses. He didn't simply urge people to sacrifice for the benefit of the Western-aligned exiles. Instead, he advocated for the expropriation of large rural estates without compensation, a welfare state, nationalization of industry, and the establishment of workers' councils. As Ciechanowski points out, by 1944, the AK faced a precarious and volatile situation, striving to prevent the PPR from gaining influence while trying to galvanize public loyalty through intensified anti-German efforts, viewing the preparation for an anti-German uprising as their paramount duty. Bohr reinforced that their only hope lay in consistently demonstrating their determination to fight Germany until the very end, regardless of the obstacles they encountered. With Russia hostile and Anglo-American forces too distant for a D-Day-like invasion, the strategy of waiting, often used by governments in exile, had reached its limit in Warsaw. Trying to spark active mass resistance, however, led the Polish leadership into direct conflict with Allied imperialism, especially Russia. This became evident during Operation Berza, or Tempest. The Home Army was supposed to emerge from hiding as soon as the Red Army entered Poland and greet Soviet commanders with a proposal to coordinate military efforts against the shared enemy. General Bohr-Komorowski emphasized that Berza was meant to show both their determination to fight the Germans and to remind the Soviets of the elements representing Poland's sovereignty. Yet it was unclear how much priority was given to an anti-fascist struggle versus restoring pre-war Poland, as Bohr found himself caught between both ideas. Berza kicked off in the Volhynia region, an area predominantly Ukrainian, with only a small Polish minority. This region had suffered under various imperial regimes, first Tsarist, then Polish, now German. To gain local support, Berlin skillfully played on Ukrainian resentment toward their Polish neighbors, resulting in significant Polish casualties. Prior to Berza, the Home Army's focus in Volhynia had been on defending the Polish community rather than attacking Germans, leading to many Ukrainian deaths. Yet, after all these tragic events, the Home Army aimed to re-establish the sovereignty of Poland. A true people's war, rooted in internationalism and highlighting the common plight of the people against all ruling classes, could have rallied substantial support for Berza in Volhynia. However, the Home Army did not pursue that approach, and when they finally showed up, the Red Army easily overpowered the resistance fighters. This scenario repeated itself in other regions. The Red Army welcomed Home Army assistance in the fight against the Germans, but once victory was achieved, they demanded that the resistance dissolve or join a puppet army commanded by General Berling. Those who stood against it faced internment or execution. Stalin aimed to reclaim eastern Poland after the war and did not want any competing factions armed. The AK was not only weak in military equipment, but it also struggled to connect with Polish nationalism in those eastern areas. Thus, Berza faltered wherever it was attempted. However, Warsaw presented a different situation. The capital had a more homogeneous population, particularly after a significant portion of its Jewish community had been eliminated. Yet throughout Operation Berza, and right up to the beginning of the Warsaw Rising, no one suggested a large-scale uprising there. Bohr-Komorowski clearly stated, "I have issued directives to prevent our diversionary actions from turning into an unplanned armed insurrection in unfavorable conditions." The fact that valuable weapons were taken out of Warsaw in the weeks leading up to the Rising indicates that the AK leadership had not planned for it. On July 14th, Bohr remarked, "Given the current situation of the German forces in Poland and the preparations against the uprising, it has no chance of success. We can only hope that the Germans collapse and their army disintegrates." A mix of pressures, not just one factor, altered this stance. There were fears that the Germans were about to deport large numbers of young people from Warsaw, which would have weakened the AK. The Red Army was advancing toward the city, and on July 29th, they broadcast a statement from Polish communists. "The time for action has arrived." It called for direct active struggle in the streets to expedite the final liberation and save the lives of our fellow countrymen. The following day, the message intensified. "Warsaw is trembling from the roar of the guns. Soviet forces are advancing and approaching Praga. They are coming to bring you freedom. Citizens of the capital, to arms." Colonel Monter, one of Bohr's subordinates, reported the same, though it turned out to be false information at a crucial AK leadership meeting. The decision for an uprising in Warsaw was made, and it commenced on August 1st, 1944. That day, the Home Army and the civilian population plunged into the largest insurrection of the Second World War. Historians debate the wisdom of that decision. Davies views the uprising as a valid effort to break free from German oppression, holding on to the hope that Allied anti-fascist promises would result in real support. Kolko argues that the leadership of the AK and the government in exile were trying to maintain their influence within the power structure, stating that the uprising was actually against both the Germans and the Russians, making it inherently doomed from the outset. This situation was a tragic culmination of the grand ambitions that the Polish leadership had pursued in London and within the Home Army. There's evidence to support both sides. General Bohr-Komorowski expressed that the overwhelming desire for revenge after years of suffering under German rule was unstoppable. The town was anxiously awaiting a signal to fight back. Yet he also alluded to the lofty ambitions of the uprising, referring to it as the last card in a game where the ultimate prize was Poland's independence. The AK was equipped for only a small fraction of its 40,000 troops and could barely sustain itself for more than a week. Nevertheless, with the Red Army positioned nearby and the Polish premier just having arrived in Moscow, there was a belief that help from the Russians would be on the way. The AK's need for outside assistance was clear, as they suffered heavy losses on the first day, losing 10% of their forces while taking down 4 Germans for every one of their fighters. Yet this did not dampen the public's eagerness to confront the Nazis. One witness recalled the joy felt at that time, stemming from the long years of suffering and humiliation endured under occupation. They were ready for anything, having learned to disregard the dangers surrounding them. Importantly, they believed that the Polish armed movement would hasten the arrival of the Soviet army in Warsaw, prompting the Germans to flee. An AK officer spoke of the passion displayed as citizens constructed anti-tank barricades and quickly set up soup kitchens to feed soldiers and those trapped by the unexpected uprising. The atmosphere in the street felt like an endless celebration. Everyone contributed in their own way to this pivotal fight. Just 3 days into the Rising, Bohr-Komorowski noted how both women and men were eager to join the AK, signing up for a variety of tasks like putting out fires, feeding the fighters, and crafting homemade petrol bombs to make up for the shortage of weapons. The Grey Ranks, part of the Polish Scout movement, played a crucial role and faced significant consequences. Despite the different reasons for getting involved, An AK officer observed in Warsaw a key aspect of this people's war. The line between fighters and participants had vanished. A British observer reflected on this, saying, "Today, a battle is unfolding that I think is quite hard for the British nation to grasp. It's a struggle led by both the civilian population and the AK." Notably, 1 in 7 combatants were women, and according to Bor Komorowski, most of them were workers, railway employees, craftsmen, students, and clerks from factories, railways, and offices. Thus, the AK's approach couldn't be compared to that of a regular army. It carried the fervor and enthusiasm of a revolution, and they credited their early successes to this passionate first wave, which more than compensated for their inadequate weaponry. However, this unity between the movement from above and below, fueled by a shared hatred of Nazi rule, could still fracture. A report sent to the government in exile from within Warsaw suggested that many were less focused on whether the Polish government aligned with the Western Allies or Russia, and more concerned with its ability to enact social reforms. The report warned against abandoning radical promises. Everything now hinged on the Russians' perspective. With Poland's fate not yet fixed by the infamous agreements and their percentages, the question remained: would they support the insurgents and the concept of people's war, similar to other communist movements, or would Stalin treat Warsaw with the same disdain that Churchill showed Athens? In examining these two leaders, we refer to Churchill's first-hand account from his History of the Second World War, where on August 4th he informed Stalin about British support for the AK, suggesting it may aid your operation. The next day, Stalin dismissed the rising as overly dramatized and lacking credibility, noting the absence of artillery, aircraft, and tanks. This was exactly the issue. The rising was strategically planned to align with the expected arrival of Red Army support. However, the week the AK believed they could hold out passed without any sign of Russian assistance. As a result, the insurgents resorted to creative tactics, and the high casualty rate ultimately contributed to arming more AK fighters with recovered weapons. Popular sentiment kept morale high, but it also fueled Nazi determination. German orders now stated that captured rebels would be shot, and the civilian population would face indiscriminate massacre. The Nazi governor, Hans Frank, declared that Warsaw deserved to be completely destroyed. On August 12th, Churchill sought to soften Stalin's stance with an appeal from Warsaw, saying they received minimal supplies and had heard nothing from him since the 3rd, leaving them without material or moral support. The soldiers and civilians looked to the skies in despair, hoping for Allied assistance, but only saw German aircraft. They felt dismayed and began to express their frustration. Churchill stressed that without immediate support, arms, ammunition, bombing enemy positions, and airdrops, their fight would collapse within days. On day 16, Stalin replied, stating he believed the Warsaw Uprising was a reckless and disastrous gamble. It was true that Rokossovski, the Red Army commander on the Polish front, encountered fierce resistance from the Germans at that time. Even Davies, a historian sympathetic to the Rising, acknowledges that there was a strong German counteroffensive to the east of the Vistula, making it unlikely for Rokossovski to cross the river successfully in large numbers. However, the Rising continued until October 2nd, creating numerous chances for the Russians to offer help. Airdrops were considered, and Churchill and Roosevelt sent a joint message to Stalin. "We are concerned about world opinion if the anti-Nazis in Warsaw are essentially left to fend for themselves. We hope you will drop immediate supplies and munitions to the Polish patriots in Warsaw, or will you agree to assist our planes in doing it quickly?" The Soviets didn't prevent British and U.S. supply planes from flying the distance from Italy, but they weren't allowed to land or refuel in Russia. Similarly, the Russians had no interest in flying the short distance from their positions to assist Warsaw. The Western Allies undertook a series of risky missions, yet they couldn't significantly change the outcome. In mid-September, the Russians finally agreed to offer limited assistance. Churchill saw through this delayed tactic. They wanted to eliminate the non-communist Poles while pretending they were coming to their aid. Harriman, the U.S. ambassador in Moscow, was horrified by the Kremlin's approach. "These men are swollen with power. and think they can impose their will on us and all countries without question. After 2 months, the insurgents ultimately surrendered. The Polish government described the grim outcome. We received no effective support. We have been treated worse than Hitler's allies in Romania, Italy, and Finland. Our rising is failing while our armies abroad are liberating France, Belgium, and Holland. Without a hint of irony, the British Prime Minister, who bombed Athens to crush the Greek resistance, echoed their sentiment. Immortal is the nation that can exhibit such universal heroism. These words are unforgettable. The struggle in Warsaw had persisted for over 60 days. Of the 40,000 men and women of the Polish underground army, about 15,000 were lost. From a population of 1 million, nearly 200,000 were affected. The suppression of the uprising cost the German army 10,000 dead, 7,000 missing, and 9,000 wounded. When the Russians arrived in the city 3 months later, they found only ruined streets and unburied corpses. Such was their liberation of Poland, where they now held power. The tragic conclusion of the Warsaw Rising stemmed from various factors, including errors made by the AK and the surprising strength of the Wehrmacht. Yet, there's no denying that Deutscher's critique of Russia rings true. The blockade of aid to Warsaw sent shockwaves through the Allied nations, marking a display of indifference that even took Stalin's Western supporters by surprise. Poland reflected a similar pattern to that seen in Greece, despite the distinct political contexts. Regardless of the ideological stances of the involved Allied governments, imperialists frequently resisted movements that didn't align with their interests. This emphasizes the notion that the Second World War was marked by both imperialist and popular struggles that often clashed. In Greece, Britain attacked the civilians, while in Poland, Russia allowed the Nazis to do their dirty work. The consequences were the same in both situations. As one Polish broadcast poignantly stated, it was a bitter comfort to acknowledge that, at least the Germans cannot take Warsaw again. All that is left is a heap of rubble. Warsaw no longer exists. Although the Second World War included 2 markedly different wars, they didn't manifest in the same way everywhere. Latvia faced only imperialist warfare, leading one writer to conclude that the good war narrative simply will not work. This observation is critical, as it reveals the conditions for a people's war when viewed alongside the experiences of Yugoslavia, Greece, and Poland. The uniqueness of Latvia's situation poses challenges for historians attempting to fit its past neatly into conventional categories of the Second World War. A recent anthology from the Commission of the Historians of Latvia identified the only group that nearly resembled a resistance movement in the Western European sense as the Perkonkrusts. This term translates to swastika in Latvian, and in a nation where a significant portion of the population consisted of ethnic minorities, the leader Selmans asserted that, in a Latvian Latvia there will only be Latvians, and the question of minorities will not exist. Members of Perkonkrusts pursued this aim by forming notorious auxiliary police battalions and commando units at the Nazis' request, resulting in the massacre of 70,000 Latvian Jews. Is it not peculiar to characterize the Swastika Party as a resistance movement in the West European sense? Valdmanis emerges as another figure of resistance. Serving as a minister in Latvia's Nazi-installed regime, he openly called on his fellow Latvians to join the war for European liberation, placing their fate in Adolf Hitler's hands. Privately, he expressed a preference for Latvia's independence to come from Germany rather than from other nations. His biographer highlights that collaboration and resistance became increasingly blurred. An official historical perspective agrees, stating that one could be both a collaborator and a committed member of the resistance. This perplexing and unsettling stance can only be understood, though it remains unjustifiable, by recognizing Latvia's occupation by Russia from 1939 to 1941, and again from 1944 to 1991. Therefore, these historians view those opposing Russia as the true resistors, while Latvians who fought against Nazism are labeled as collaborators instead of resistance fighters. They dispute the Nuremberg Consensus, believing the trials of Nazi war criminals reflected a victor's perspective that overlooked Soviet atrocities. This contentious interpretation continues to have implications today. One Latvian dissident warns that the realities of the Holocaust and mass killings that occurred in Latvia during the German occupation remain either consciously or unconsciously neglected. As recently as May 2010, influenced by the Latvian government, the European Court upheld the conviction of Kononov, the sole anti-Nazi partisan, successfully prosecuted as a war criminal. He led an assault on a village thought to shelter German collaborators, resulting in the deaths of 9 individuals, including a pregnant woman. The Latvian state contended that the court should consider the broader historical context surrounding World War II, including the earlier Soviet occupation. The confusion stems from the lack of a people's war in Latvia, which can be traced back to its geographical and historical circumstances. With an area just 1/264th that of Russia's and 1/7 that of Germany's, Latvia has long been subjugated by these dominant neighbors. Teutonic Knights seized control in the 13th century, and although Baltic Germans accounted for only 4% of the population by the early 20th century, they still exerted significant economic and social control. Above them loomed an authoritarian, czarist regime that upheld aggressive Russification policies. Even after gaining independence in 1918, ethnic minorities still held control over more than 3/4 of private enterprises. In this context, attitudes toward imperialism became crucial. The leading political party at the time, the Latvian Social Democratic Workers' Party, adopted a stance of left internationalism. Their policy mirrored that of Luxembourg, asserting that as long as Russian or German imperialism persisted, the push for independence was impractical for a nation as vulnerable as Latvia. They believed that only by allying with revolutionary workers striving to dismantle these imperialist regimes from within could they find success. Therefore, Stucka, the party leader, emphasized the necessity of focusing on class struggle over national struggles. This approach led to significant labor actions during the 1905 Russian Revolution, where workers in Riga participated in mass strikes that challenged Tsarist authority, while the peasant class, the largest social group, confronted the local German landowners. However, imperialism regained its footing, and during World War I, Latvia became a contested region between Germany and Russia. It narrowly avoided devastation when the Bolshevik uprising in 1917 resulted in Russia's exit from the war. Latvian riflemen played a significant role as supporters of Bolshevism during this time. Nevertheless, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918 forced Moscow to surrender the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to Germany. This act likely thwarted a successful revolution in Latvia that could have had widespread popular support. In 1918, as leftist influence diminished, nationalist groups, predominantly of the middle and upper classes, gained momentum. They harbored fears of the Latvian workers and their internationalist ideals, seeking alliances with any capitalist power that could offer them a state with jobs, status, and the authority to suppress domestic opposition. Britain, opposing both communism and the Kaiser, was the first nation to recognize Latvia diplomatically in October. Full independence followed swiftly after Germany's surrender in the First World War. Latvia entered the interwar period with a parliamentary democracy, but this changed after President Ulmanis's visit to Nazi Germany in 1934, which led to the rise of fascism. His initial target was the communists, labeling their support for a foreign entity as unpatriotic. Eventually, all political parties, including the Perkonkrusts and his own, were banned. Ulmanis, while not overtly embracing extreme anti-Semitism, clearly supported the general message of the Perkonkrusts, pushing phrases like Latvia for the Latvians and Latvia is a Latvian state. The pact between Hitler and Stalin resulted in the Baltic states falling under Russian control, and in 1940, Soviet forces ousted Ulmanis. In a statement reminiscent of Orwell's work, the newly established People's Government of Free Citizens of Latvia claimed that the presence of the Red Army in Latvia and the warm welcome they received was clear evidence of strong ties and brotherly friendship with the USSR. An election yielded a striking 98% confidence vote for the Working People's Bloc, which was actually the Latvian Communist Party, the only party allowed to participate. At that time, the party had just 400 members, with only 50 being ethnic Latvians. By August 1940, Latvia was incorporated into the USSR and its community of brother and great socialist lands and fortunate nations. Some Latvians were convinced by the propaganda. Swain's insightful history of Daugavpils illustrates how many believed that Russian dominance signified the rise of Soviets, workers' and soldiers' councils. At the Italia factory, the Soviets reduced working hours, reinstated an employee mistreated under the fascist regime, and ensured pay for the days of the revolution. In military barracks, food quality improved, fascist elements were removed, and all nationalities were promised equal rights to promotions and holidays. However, these hopes were dashed quickly. Under Russian control, Latvia experienced what Swain describes as a 5-year plan in 5 months. Authority shifted back to factory managers, and party committees replaced the more inclusive Soviets. Rationing was introduced along with a shocking 300% rise in food prices. Through the Stakhanovite movement, workers were encouraged to increase productivity under the watchful eye of the secret police. While the Hitler-Stalin Pact remained in effect, communists were instructed that their mission was no longer to engage in a global struggle against fascism, but rather to convince a doubtful populace of the advantages of joining the Soviet Union. The Baltic economies were to be swiftly assimilated into the USSR's preparations for war. By July 1940, the government nationalized all major businesses and banks. Changes in land ownership occurred, which, while not amounting to full collectivization, led many peasants to fear that the government would soon seize their farms. The Baltic states, being near Leningrad and home to German minorities that Hitler could exploit to justify an invasion, prompted the decision to remove them alongside other perceived threats. Thousands were deported, igniting deep resentment. This process unfolded in 4 waves, reaching a peak in June 1941 when 15,000 people, including 2,400 children under 10, were sent to Siberia under horrifying conditions. This marked the regime's final significant action. Official accounts in Latvia today refer to this period of deportations as the Year of Horror, with some placing blame on the Jews for these events. One person noted that a segment of the Jewish population, particularly those involved in the socialist movement, supported and actively collaborated with Soviet authorities. Given the alternative of Nazi governance, this reaction was hardly unexpected. Another observer pointed out that the prominent role of Jews in the new regime led Latvians to associate the entire Jewish community with the despised Soviet government. Additionally, it was mentioned that 3 key figures in the security apparatus were of Jewish descent, reinforcing stereotypes prevalent in occupied Latvia. A more balanced perspective highlighted that Latvians noticed the perpetrators included not only Russians and Latvians, but also Jews, prompting the refrain, "Again those Jews." Yet this stereotype was misleading. The Jewish community in Latvia endured the harshest consequences. Although they made up only 5% of the population, they represented 11% of those deported. This disparity stemmed from their economic roles, seen as threats to Russia's monopoly. The Soviets viewed all conquered groups as potential risks, aiming to forcibly integrate them into the communist framework. With Jews lacking national status in Soviet theory, efforts were made to assimilate them swiftly, dismantling their communal and religious structures. However, once again, Jews became victims, as the actions of one oppressor drove many Latvians directly into the arms of another. One book describes how, due to the deportations, the long-held view of Germans as Latvia's main enemies shifted dramatically. Suddenly, the primary adversary became Russia and the communists. This shift influenced how the Germans were received upon their invasion. Latvia's Soviet regime fell apart in June 1941, overwhelmed by the German army. As it had happened before with Ulmanis's regime, there was a brief period where neither power dominated completely. Yet, there was no organized resistance to Nazism. Those on the left, who had managed to survive Ulmanis's oppressive rule, found themselves confused and discredited due to the Stalinist era. Instead, a grassroots national partisan movement came to life, targeting the retreating Red Army, aiding the German advance, and rounding up communists and Jews. Nazi supporters established a center for Latvian organizations to assume local control, but the new authorities disregarded it. The Nazis found willing allies in nearly every country they occupied, from Quisling in Norway to Pétain in France. However, in areas recently affected by Soviet deportations, such as the Baltic states and Ukraine, this partnership was especially pronounced. The American writer Dean observed that it was relatively easy for the Nazis to enlist locals willing to execute their horrific agendas. Latvian historians emphasize that their compatriots did not engage in genocide without prompting from outside forces. In most instances, the transition from Russian to German control lasted less than a day, and there is little evidence of widespread spontaneous killings of Jews in that short span. Nevertheless, the rapidity of the events was remarkable. The Holocaust is typically marked from late summer 1941, becoming widespread by October. Yet in Latvia, the final solution began on June 23rd, just 2 days after the Germans took control. By mid-August, a large percentage of Jews in rural areas were executed, with the Zemgala region experiencing a total loss. This thoroughness was only achievable with considerable local collaboration and knowledge. As Dean comments more broadly, there was an element of the perpetrators personally knowing the victims, which adds a chilling intimacy to the massacres. The Latvian self-defense commands were responsible for identifying and capturing victims, with 700 units forming in just a matter of weeks. Clearly, the occupying forces had no trouble finding volunteers. A look into the Krustpils area reveals the inner workings at a local level. Both the executors and those giving orders hailed from Krustpils or nearby parishes. Typically, Germans were absent from these small group operations targeting Jews, giving local collaborators the freedom to act. Across all Latvian regions, local perpetrators aimed to alleviate the psychological burden on the executioners, often trying to impress the occupying authorities by exceeding their expectations. Collaboration among Latvians was largely self-organized. In addition to the German Einsatzgruppen, organizations like the Aries Commando, made up of 1,600 members led by a former Perkonkrusts participant, played a significant role, directly responsible for the deaths of 26,000 individuals and associated with another 34,000 fatalities. While factors like greed, sadism, and anti-Semitism drove the Aries Commando, one volunteer's court testimony stood out as revealing and typical. He joined in order to fight against remnants of the Red Army, Soviet activists, and other supporters of the Soviet regime. It's important to note that not all locals shared the genocidal aims of the self-defense squads. Members of the Aries Commando acknowledged they would be killing countless individuals, but recognized that the broader population did not support the murder of women and children, despite the prevalence of anti-Semitism. German officials noted that Latvians acted passively towards Jews and remarked that, contrary to what they had expected, local forces had only managed to eliminate a few thousand victims. In fact, about 400 individual Latvians have been identified who took significant personal risks to protect Jews from persecution. The relationship between Nazi officials and Latvians was shaped by the reality that the Baltic states were the only part of Eastern Europe intended for integration into the Reich following Germanization, which meant assimilating only 50% deemed racially suitable while exiling or exterminating the rest. Consequently, Nazi authorities favored Latvians over other East Europeans, yet they simultaneously opposed any notions of Latvian independence. Could the suppression of national ambitions be the foundation for a people's war? In Riga, the Germans set up a self-administration under General Dankers. While most historians regard these organizations as Quisling regimes, some Latvian historians view the self-administration as a form of resistance. Is that accurate? When the occupiers called for police battalions to be formed, Minister Valdmanis proposed that Latvians should demand concessions from the Germans in exchange for cooperation. It's hard to argue that negotiating collaboration equates to resistance, yet Dankers dismissed Valdmanis's suggestion regardless. By the end of the war, 49 battalions comprising 15,000 individuals were active. The label police battalion was misleading, as their responsibilities included combat on the Eastern Front, guarding the Warsaw Ghetto Sea, and transporting Jews to the Treblinka death camp. Dankers's submissive strategy did nothing to ease the exploitation Latvia suffered. The Nazis treated it with the same brutality as the Russians. In Audrini village, where Red Army soldiers were hidden, all 235 residents were killed, and the village was burned. The anti-partisan winter magic operation along Latvia's Russian border involved creating a 40-kilometer no-man's land. Women and children who stayed faced concentration camps or deportation to Germany, while the men were either shot or deported. The economic exploitation was just as blatant. The Germans kept property that had been confiscated during the Soviet era as spoils of war. It was later estimated that Germany cost Latvia $660 million, compared to Russia's $1 billion, with 265,000 Latvians enslaved for labor in the Reich. When willing workers ran out, as Swain describes, there was a hunt for people where snatch squads forcibly grabbed whoever was nearby and loaded them onto trucks at gunpoint. Many at the time saw a stark resemblance to the Russian period. One German official noted that their methods were so brutal that they could definitely be compared to the tactics of the Russian Cheka. A communist prisoner told his captors, "We have treated our people so poorly that it would be truly remarkable to treat them worse. You Germans have achieved that." Another suspected that the Nazis were not Germans at all, but merely Russians in different uniforms. All of this provided more than enough reason to rise against the Germans. Finding evidence of opposition is quite a challenge. In a desperate attempt to locate any, some Latvian historians assert they've identified an elusive anti-fascist element within a force proposed by Himmler in May 1943, the Latvian SS Volunteer Legion, a unit boasting 150,000 members. They describe this as the legal center of resistance to German rule. Why do they argue this? First, they claim it wasn't truly a volunteer force, since most of the Legion was conscripted. But even if they're correct, being conscripted doesn't equate to being resistors. Their second argument suggests that Latvians directly confronted Germany about its formation. When the self-administration reviewed Himmler's suggestion, it reignited the previous debate about whether to seek more recruits in exchange for concessions or to grant concessions as a reward for more recruits. Valdmanis aimed for Germany to provide Latvia with a better puppet status in return for rallying 100,000 soldiers, but the self-administration proposed something more modest, appointing Latvia's General Bangurskis to lead. That request was denied, yet the self-administration ultimately surrendered and approved the Legion regardless. The Nazis made the smallest concession in return, promoting Bangurskis to General Inspector with the rank of SS Gruppenführer and Waffen-SS Lieutenant General. So, what remains of this legal center of resistance? Just this. A Latvian spirit prevailed in the Legion from the outset. For example, orders were given in Latvian, and the ranks, roll calls, and prayer hymn mirrored those of the old Latvian army. We're meant to believe that fighting alongside Nazi Germany qualifies as resistance, as long as the hymns are sung in Latvian. A slightly more credible perspective on the Legion is that, though fighting alongside an unwanted ally, Latvian soldiers fought bravely against their greater enemy, the Communists. This has been supported by research into foreign veterans of the Waffen-SS, which indicates that while few Finns and Norwegians were enthusiastic about the Nazi crusade against Bolshevism, every Latvian cited anti-communism as their main motivation. Does the idea of resistance gain any credibility from the fact that the Germans suppressed certain prominent Latvians? It's true that the Nazis had disdain for those who valued collaboration. When Selmans protested the banning of his Per Conquest party, he was sent to Flossenburg concentration camp. Valdmanis faced deportation in 1943. However, while Selmans was treated as an inmate of honor, that was not the case for the 1,100 Latvians who perished in the camp. Valdmanis's deportation resulted in him being placed in Berlin's most prestigious hotel. It seems rather absurd to equate these individuals with true resistance fighters elsewhere who faced torture and death. Our final example of anti-Nazi resistance is the Central Council of Latvia. Bill Manis, Latvia's ambassador to the United States before the war, stated that it represented the principles of the Atlantic Charter and adhered to a policy anticipating the victory of Great Britain and the United States. Supported by Latvia's four largest pre-war parties, the Central Council of Latvia, as noted in a current official history, was deemed the largest and most influential resistance organization, with its key stance being opposition to both occupying forces, Nazi and Soviet. However, the evidence for such balanced resistance against totalitarianism is limited. Even those who assert this recognize that the Central Council of Latvia didn't actively resist the Nazis, reasoning that military action would only serve to weaken Nazi Germany and thus expedite the return of the Soviet regime. The Central Council of Latvia's policy statement, endorsed by 190 notable figures, is praised but seldom quoted. In truth, it wasn't a declaration against Nazism at all. The statement begins with a warning about the approaching Eastern threat to Latvia. It then laments that Nazi obstruction of nationalist goals was preventing complete mobilization of Latvia's inhabitants into the German armed forces. Furthermore, it was a plea directed toward Latvia's own SS Gruppenführer and Waffen-SS Lieutenant General Bangerskis, who the Germans turned to in their final hours to lead a makeshift administration that would conceal their unlawful actions. It's telling of the frailty of resistance that the Nazis in the Courland region of Latvia capitulated a day after Germany itself did, officially concluding the Second World War in Europe. Additionally, there was another faction claiming the title of resistance in Latvia, the pro-Soviet partisans. Their ties to Moscow made recruitment difficult, as evidenced by a thorough study indicating they struggled to establish a presence beyond the cities of Riga and Liepāja, as well as the Russian border area of Latgal. When the exiled Latvian Communist Party Central Committee attempted to set up operations in Latvia, ground partisans deemed it unfeasible, leading to extended efforts from neighboring Belarusia. Eventually, the brutal actions of the Nazis drew recruits, starting with the ethnic Russian community and then expanding further. By 1943, there were more volunteers than weapons available to arm them, as noted in a partisan report stating, "In Latgal, everyone is waiting for the Red Army to return due to the taxes, soaring prices, and demands from the Germans." By the war's end, units like the Red Arrow, made up of Red Army paratroopers, Latvian communists, and deserters from the Legion, were actively engaging the enemy in various regions. During the Stalin era, estimates of 20,000 partisans were mentioned, although a more accurate figure reported by its own leadership upon disbanding in October 1944 was 5,900. Additionally, over 40,000 Latvians who fought with the Red Army's Latvian Rifleman Division and other units must be acknowledged. However, they were just as entangled in imperialism as the Latvian SS Legion. This clash of empires and the absence of a people's option led to a civil war where both factions harmed their own people in service of foreign oppressors. The pro-Soviet government that followed the Nazis after World War II struggled to gain local backing, making it hard to find enough native speakers for its offices. In the Daugavpils district, half of the key positions were filled by Russians, with only 1 in 6 being ethnically Latvian. Their actions only worsened their unpopularity. Deportations resumed, with 150,000 individuals sent to Siberia in the first 5 months of 1945. The plight of ordinary civilians illustrates the absence of a people's war. They were trapped between two powerful imperial forces. This reality was poignantly highlighted in an interview with a woman in Riga who had a grandfather in the SS Legion and another in the Red Army. Her grandmother's farm was seized by Soviets in 1940 and then by the Wehrmacht in 1941, with both invading forces plundering it, followed by the partisans in the war's final days. Another woman recounted her family's ordeal after the Nazis arrived. "My father was imprisoned. My youngest brother was deported to Germany at just 18 years old. Eventually, he was taken to the concentration camp at Stutthof in Danzig. At 17, I was deported to Germany to work on the land. In 1944, the communists seized control of Latvia for the second time. Amid the chaos of war, I lost contact with my family. Later, I learned that my father had been marched to Russia at 71 and had died somewhere along the way. The aftermath of the Second World War in Latvia was just as bleak. Without a people's war to balance things out, imperialism completely dictated the fate of the people. At the last moment, Latvian nationalists withdrew their loyalty from the defeated Germans, hoping for a sympathetic response from the Allies. It made no difference. The outcomes of the Tehran and Potsdam conferences legitimized the gains Stalin made through his agreement with Hitler. This undermined the national partisans, about 20,000 of whom resisted Soviet control after 1944. Many had been trained by German counterintelligence and by 1953 had killed over 3,000 Red Army soldiers, roughly matching their own losses. Latvians who had fought alongside the Germans represented the largest group of captured non-German enemy personnel. When the Cold War began, Britain declared that Baltic Waffen-SS veterans were not war criminals but displaced persons. They accepted the argument from the pre-war Latvian ambassador that people like Arais were great national patriots, anti-Bolshevik, but certainly not to be labeled as fascists. The U.S. employed Valdmanis, claiming he had never been involved in politics and had an excellent character and background. Latvian historians have attempted to normalize their country's past by framing it with a narrative of resistance. However, this is not possible, as there was no movement that stood apart from the various forms of imperialism. The outcome was the annihilation of the Jews and devastation for the local survivors. Latvia serves as a stark example of how devastating the Second World War could have been and highlights the importance of a people's war in other contexts. The shared circumstance was that each nation faced occupation by the Axis powers, yet the responses to this challenge were vastly different. On one side, we have Yugoslavia, where the people's struggle capitalized on divisions within imperialism to succeed. In Greece, Elas valiantly stood up to Axis imperialism, but was ultimately denied victory by British intervention. Meanwhile, the Polish struggle, highlighted by the Warsaw Rising, lacked the necessary firepower to overcome the Nazis on its own and was callously forsaken by the imperialist power that could have lent support. Latvia's situation may be the most heartbreaking, if not the most extensive. The relentless onslaught of imperialist invasions stifled any possibility for a people's alternative to form. The tragic outcome was a dreadful mini-Holocaust, during which segments of the local population mistakenly aligned with one imperialist faction, the Nazis, in the misguided belief that they could retaliate against Russian imperialism by harming Jews. Now let's shift our focus to the Allied nations. Unlike Yugoslavia, Greece, or Poland, Britain and the United States did not experience Axis occupation. Still, the impact of the two wars was felt there as well.